Revelation 3255. From the 15th of September 1944. New course of development. Banishing the spiritual. The course of development of the spiritual is interrupted by divine will. What has been in constant upward development for infinite times and now fails at the end, that is, stands still or declines in development, is prevented from further decline and is bound again. Because a decline or standstill of development can only happen in the state of free will, while the bound will always means an ascent development, indeed in a state of compulsion, but also most extensively adapted to the will of the beingness, which is apparent to God at all times. The binding of free will now again necessitates new external forms, which are in accordance with the hardness of the opposing will and must now again hold the spiritual within themselves, which starts the course of development anew. In God's eternal order and lawfulness there can only be an upward development where His will is active, and only the free will of man can overturn this order. To a certain extent God does not interfere with the human being's free will. He leaves him complete freedom as to how he uses the last embodiment on earth for his spiritual development. However, if there is a danger that all spiritual ascent development will be prevented, that the spiritual being which strives towards God will also be dragged into a state of lightlessness, then the divine will put a stop to it by depriving the spiritual being which is acting against his will of its free will, by binding it again in the firmest form in order to give it every opportunity to change its opposing will, which irrevocably has to happen once, even if eternities pass over it. For every decision has to take place in free will, and free will always presupposes a stage of maturity where the spiritual being can embody itself as a human being again. Eternities pass for the spiritual being which time and again lets this free will become active in a wrong way, and therefore ever harder and more difficult tasks have to be set for it so that it will finally give up its resistance against God and turn to Him in a state of free will. Understandably, therefore, at the end of a period of development, the God-opposing spiritual will always start to rage extremely strongly because it feels that it will soon be deprived of its power and because it now seeks to also take control of what is full of light because it believes it will thereby reduce God's power. And this battle with the light takes on such forms shortly before the end that only a violent intervention by God protects the lightful, for the adversary's power has become tremendously strong due to humanity's voluntary support, and this always means the end. For God will take away His power as soon as the battle against the light becomes undisguised, as soon as people who strive towards the light shall be forced to turn to darkness. Then Satan's fight is directed against God Himself, and then he finds his master in him. The binding in form robs all dark spiritual of all strength and power. It cannot be active in any work of creation according to its own will but has to be active according to God's will. It has to serve in a state of compulsion and thereby cover the course of higher development. It has to bring itself in an infinitely long time to the state of maturity again which earns it the last embodiment on earth. As a human being, using free will. As long as divine will alone is decisive, there is no regression, and thus the beingness must mature as long as it is in bound will, although the strength of the opposing will also determines the external form and therefore also the extent of the torments of being bound. Only when God withdraws His will from the being in so far as He gives it the freedom of its will, thus allowing it to determine itself, is there a danger that the upward development will experience a standstill or a decline, and this again up to the limit which God has set. Then He will interrupt the course of development for the spiritual being and it will have to start anew in a new earthly period which is intended for its final redemption again if it is utilized correctly in the last stage. For only the perfect can get rid of its external form, and only through the right use of its freedom of will can the spiritual in the human being become perfect. Amen.